If we got everything, all the spheres into the Sphere Museum, and itself maybe was even spherical, and we blew it up, are spheres no longer like no one can make a sphere anymore?
Yeah, I mean, one of the weird things about Armstrong's view, or anyone for that matter who holds to the principle of instantiation,
Yeah.
You're saying, well, the existence of a property depends upon some object having that property, right?
Mm-hmm.
So sphericity exists only if there's a sphere somewhere, right? So
Yeah.
you're saying, put all the spheres in one room, blow it up, right?
Yeah.
What happens to the property?
Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. This is a podcast where we explore thoughts, all the deepest thoughts, that is, in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I'm your host, Parker Case, and I always invite experts in philosophy, theology, nature, and life to come help me think through their ideas and what they're experts in. So today is no different in this episode. I have with me Dr. Robert Garcia. He's an associate professor of philosophy at Baylor University. And we're going to be talking about tropes. I'm really excited about that. And it's not tropes like cliches or negative statements or anything like that. It's some metaphysics. We're going to be getting in on tropes. It's going to be really, really fun. And then I'm going to try and think through what an NFT is, a non-fungible token. And I'm going to propose that to Dr. Garcia and see what does he make of it? Is it a token? Is it a trope? What do we make of this? So I'm trying to do some public facing philosophy, right? I'm trying to do that for you guys. So I hope you guys enjoy that. Stay tuned to learn all about tropes and NFTs. Before we jump in, though, I want to thank everyone over on Patreon for making this podcast happen. You guys are so huge, and so many of you have supported me on there. I appreciate it like crazy. I got my puppy in the other room. He is a product of the patrons. So I appreciate that. If you guys like this podcast, if you're top 10, top 5 favorite podcast, please consider becoming a Patreon patron. You can find the link in the description wherever you're getting this podcast at. If you're listening on the audio, then please go ahead and leave me a 5-star review and a comment. That would be huge. Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And then if you're on YouTube, let me know what you think about this. What do you think about tropes? Like, we're going to be getting in deep. Let me know in the comments. That'd be huge. And last but not least, man, there's so much of this. You can join our Facebook Parker's Pensées Penseurs Facebook group. And if you promise not to spam unrelated stuff, I will let you in. You can talk to a lot of the guests that I've had on the podcast. So without further ado, let's bring in Dr. Robert Garcia to talk about tropes. Robert, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, man.
You're welcome. Thanks for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I love your podcast. I think you're doing great things, and kind of flattered to be a part of it. So,
man, that's awesome. That's so cool. I heard you talk at the Society of Christian Philosophers down in Florida, and I was like, man, I have to talk with this guy because I love what you do. I love that you go in so deep in philosophy and you apply it to your Christian faith as well. And I love that. I love that intersection. But you are a Christian. And so I wanted to ask, why did you want to become a professional philosopher instead of a professional theologian?
I never wanted to be a professional anything except for a professional cyclist when I was in high school. That was my
Wow.
goal.
Yeah.
It didn't work out. I don't know. One day I just woke up and I sort of realized that I was sort of on a track to being some kind of academic, and it was too late to change course. And I ended up going into philosophy, just following my own interests in theology and apologetics, trying to figure out why my professors were saying the things they were saying in my theology classes as an undergrad, and eventually discovered, there's a real history here that's steeped in philosophy, and philosophy is where the action is at. It's where all the heavy lifting happens, and so I just followed my own questions and ended up where I am today somehow.
Yeah. Well, so where did you do your dissertation, and what was the topic?
I did it at Notre Dame, and finished in 2009. and my dissertation was on tropes, basically.
Nice.
My advisor was Michael Lux, who's done a lot of work in metaphysics and in properties and Platonism and so on. And but I started off. I did a master's degree at Talbot School of Theology,
Okay.
and my first course in metaphysics ever was there with J.P. Moreland, and that's the first time I heard of tropes, was in his class and in reading his book, and that was my introduction to the topic.
Oh wow, has he like thoroughly disowned you now, since you're like you're a trope theorist, man? Like that's not.
We're still friends.
Okay,
No.
okay, that's good.
Yeah, it's funny. We haven't had an in-depth conversation about that, but we're still good friends. And yeah, I don't know. I'd be curious to know what he thinks of my proposal concerning tropes and divine actions.
Yeah. Especially since it came from his book. Yeah, he sparked it for you, the whole trope, getting into tropes, at least. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I certainly don't. I don't go in for the kinds of tropes that he had in mind. So, yeah, I guess I need to go talk to him.
That's awesome. Yeah. If it's super spicy, record that and we could put it on the channel. That would be even more fun. Well, so I thought we could start off with some definitions here, because a lot of people are gonna hear tropes in like the popular modern parlance. That's just a trope or something like that. He's as like a cliche and usually like a negative in negative rhetoric or something like that. What is a trope? That's like a deep question, but can you give us like a huge bird's eye view of what a trope is?
I can try.
Okay.
The first thing to notice is that tropes are a theoretical posit. So it's controversial whether there are any tropes. So when I talk about tropes, I'm talking about a way of understanding the things in the world.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a metaphysical explanation for the kinds of phenomena that we take ourselves to be presented with. I guess that's the first thing to say. Tropes are not, in metaphysics, tropes are not supposed to be recurring themes in literature. That's a literary trope. It's a very different kind of notion.
Yeah.
So the one way to think of it is, in metaphysics, there are debates about properties and objects, long-standing debates going as far back as you can go in philosophy. And so whether properties exist and what they're like, that's the kind of room that you're in when you're talking about tropes. So a trope then, if you think there are tropes, then you think that there are properties, and that properties are among the fundamental entities. They're not built up out of more basic things.
Yeah.
And so they're fundamental and they're properties. And to say they're properties is to say that they play a certain kind of role in metaphysics, a property role.
Okay.
Hey, there he is.
Yeah, he's being a pain right now, but yeah. So there's certain, it's to commit yourself to properties. Yeah.
Yes. And there's a question like, what does it mean to think there are properties? And I think one of the most helpful things in the literature is a distinction between property roles and role players.
Yeah.
So property roles are like explanatory roles. Like we need something to account for, and then you point at some phenomena in the world, something that needs to be explained, and then properties are deployed or appealed to or posited in order to explain the thing that you need to explain.
And you get there from like indispensability type arguments, right?
That's one way.
Okay.
So one way to get there is by saying, well, we can't help but quantify over properties. They're indispensable to our theories. We can't paraphrase them away. We can't paraphrase away quantification over properties.
Yeah.
So if our theories are true, then it looks like we're committed to properties. That's one way. That's an important way. Another more traditional way is to say, well, we have what's called the one over many phenomenon in the world.
Yeah.
That there are many things that are all the same way, right? So all the books behind you have the same shape, right? So there's a one, having that shape over the many, the books. What must the world be like for it to be possible for many things to be the same in some respect?
Yeah.
And that's one. Oh well, there are properties of shape. There are shape properties, and to have the same shape is for there to be a property that's shared by all the books, for example.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
the other way is it's called the many over one phenomenon, where a single thing, just take your dog, a single object has multiple characteristics,
Yeah.
and it can gain and lose properties. And so, how is it that one thing can have many properties and gain and lose them over time, and so on?
I love this stuff. This is so good. I'm getting all fired up here. So then in that discussion, you have in those kind of classic arguments, realists will say that means there's these properties and they're multiply uh, instantiable. I don't think they say realizable. I think that's from philosophy of mind, but they're multiply. Yeah, they inhere or I'm trying to think through Aristotle and Plato's language. Plato says uh, they're multiply instantiable is Aristotle, and then they're exemplified.
Yeah.
Plato language, right? But all saying like they're shared. They can be shared by all the books. They all participate in the form of bookness, right?
Yeah. Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So properties. If you think there are properties, then you think there are things that play these property roles. But then you have many more decisions to make in terms of, how you understand properties. And a key sort of dividing point among those who take properties to exist is whether or not properties are shareable or repeatable. Or you could also think of it in terms of how to understand shareability. So one sort of tradition thinks that properties are shareable in the sense that the very same numerically one property can be had by numerically distinct objects at the same time.
Yeah.
Right. So if all of your books have the exact same shape, then there is a single property of shape that's somehow shared by all those books. It's one way to think of it is when we use the word same, we can mean numerical sameness or not numerical sameness, but exact similarity. So one group of the first tradition I mentioned, when you use the word same to talk about the books having the same shape, they mean numerical sameness.
Yeah.
In the same way that I would say, hey, Parker, you and I have the same president, right? There's just one president, Biden. But if I say, hey, we have the same shirt, right? I don't hopefully mean that we're literally stuffed into a single shirt. What I mean is there are two shirts, and I'm wearing one, you're wearing the other, and those shirts are exactly similar, right?
Yeah.
The other tradition takes sameness in that sense, and that's trope theory is the dominant stream in that tradition. So a trope theorist would say, when we talk about two objects sharing a property or having the same property, we don't mean that there's just exactly one property that somehow they both share. Rather, we mean that there are two properties, and those properties are exactly similar, but numerically distinct.
Yeah.
And each book has one.
Okay. This is good. So does the type token, does that help, that type token distinction here, or would that just be confusing things?
It does help to, I think, introduce the concept of a repeatable property, shareable property, and you can count tokens or you can count types. So if I said, if I say, how many letters are in my last name? You might say 5. It's Garcia, right? If you count 5, you're counting tokens, right? But there are 2 A's in my last name. So you might say, oh, there are 4, right? You don't double count the A because we're counting
Right.
types of letters. So that's an example of the type token distinction. You talk about token letters or types of letters. And if you look at the, my last name has 2 A's in it. You could say, oh, they're both instances of the type A.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Okay.
And that's a case of one over many, right?
Oh, does the type token does that cross both streams, numerical sameness stream and exact similarity stream? Is everyone going to use type tokens, or is that more on the trope theorist wheelhouse?
I think it's just understood in different ways by
Okay.
each tradition. Yeah.
Okay.
The realist, that is someone who believes in shareable properties, usually called universals, they'll understand or analyze the type token distinction. One way they might analyze it is to say, well, look, there are 2 A's in my last name. We might say they're both instances of the same type, but sort of being A is a property that each has, but there's just one such property, being A. So that would be a way to understand the type token distinction. You would say that tokens, each token of the type A literally shares the type, right?
Okay.
For a trope theorist, types are handled in different ways. So what a trope theorist doesn't want to say is, let's think about different kinds of properties like sphericity. If you have a bunch of billiard balls, they're going to say, just assuming they're perfectly spherical, well, each ball has its own shape property, the sphericity property. So there are as many sphericity properties as there are billiard balls here. And those sphericity properties are merely numerically distinct. They're exactly similar, but there are many of them. Now, if you ask the trope theorist, well, what accounts for the fact that all of these tropes are the same type of trope, right? What makes it the case that these sphericities are all sphericities? The usual answer is to say nothing does. It's a primitive fact, right? It sort of follows from more basic facts about each trope. It's primitive. This trope is primitively spherical. This other trope is primitively spherical. So it just follows that there are multiple spherical tropes.
Can't go back any further. It's primitive. Stop asking.
What they don't want to do is say, well, there's a universal, namely, it could be described as being a sphericity property or being a sphericity trope. And you don't want to say, well, each of these sphericity tropes has the very same universal, being a sphericity trope, because then that would just give up on trope theory.
Yeah.
So they're not going to go up a level. Most trope theorists aren't going to have both universals and tropes.
Okay. Okay.
There's another way to do it, and it's Douglas Ehring's way, and it's to say, well, it's not a primitive fact about each trope that it is the trope that it is. Rather, say a sphericity trope is a sphericity trope in virtue of belonging to a class of trope, where the class is primitively a natural class.
Okay.
It's a more complicated view, and it's not the normal way. It's not the traditional trope theory that does that.
I wonder.
The usual way is to say it's primitive at the level of tropes.
So the class, Ehring's way is to posit a class, and that's to go one step further in explanation, which is cool. But then why are all those things in this class?
It's just brute.
Okay, that is the brute. That's
Yeah.
I'm always
Yeah.
just accept it. That's how it is. Okay.
Yeah. And he has his reasons for thinking that's on the whole a better theory than somebody like Heath Campbell or Anna Sophia Marin or Donald Williams, who would take the character of an individual trope to be primitive.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
For Ehring, it's not primitive. It's a trope is the trope it is in virtue of belonging to a class, and it's at the level of those classes that the explanation stops.
Does it? I know like grounding language is really fun nowadays. Everyone likes grounding. Is it grounded in that class? Is that like we're gonna get into the modifier tropes and module tropes, and it seems like tropes kind of have like powers to do things depending on which. I think actually both of them would have powers, but where would that trope on Ehring's view? Where would it get that power from? Like, if it's how does the class like confer the power of a sphere trope to make something spherical? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. The kind of grounding, it's not efficient causal.
Okay.
Right. So it's just a grounding that's understood in terms of metaphysical explanation or something. So it's not the case that the set somehow in an efficient causal sense does something to its members, these tropes. Right.
Okay.
I mean, if you're going in for properties in the traditional sense, then you're already going in for this kind of relationship, this grounding, this character grounding relationship.
Yeah.
That's not an efficient causal kind of relationship. And so for Ehring, it's the set that confers. It's the set that grounds the nature and even the identity of its members. These are all sphericity tropes because they belong to this natural class.
Okay. Yeah, someone should come out with an idea that like maybe God confers on the tropes. That'd be really nice.
That would be cool. Somebody should write that up.
Yeah, definitely. For those who are listening, Robert's done that, so it's really really cool stuff, and we're gonna get into that. Okay, so we got tropes. They are. I read like 5-year pieces for this, so I'm sorry I don't know where they all come from, but the quotes I pull and stuff. But tropes are unshareable properties, particularized properties. Unlike a universal, a trope cannot characterize multiple non-overlapping objects at once. So like you have this book has this trope of rectangularness, and that one has that one, and they are not exactly similar. They're exactly similar, but they're distinct, right?
Numerically distinct. Yeah.
Numerically distinct. Okay.
Yeah. They're not qualitatively different.
Yes.
They're merely numerically distinct. Yeah.
Okay. This is so good, man. This is helping me level up. And then there's this next distinction is so cool. And I first heard about it from Brendan Rickabaugh when he was on the podcast, and he hits me with module trope and modifier trope, as if like I should know that. And it rocked my world on the podcast. I was like, dude, I can't even interpret what you're saying right now. And but then after reading some of your work here, and I heard you at SCP, that makes sense to me now. So I'm really pumped to bring this out to the audience. Can you help us? Like, what's a modifier trope, and how is that different than a module trope?
Sure, I can try. So the first thing is to put on the table the general concept of a trope, which we've talked about, but just think about it. It's a fundamental entity, so it's not built up out of other things. It grounds the character of objects, and it's non-shareable, right? So if it can ground the character of only one object at a time.
Okay.
So it's fundamental. It's a property. It's non-shareable. That's the kind of key concepts inside of it constituent concepts of the concept of a trope.
Yeah.
So when you think about an ordinary case, like you have a billiard ball or you have several billiard balls, and you say, well, they're all spherical. So the trope theorist is going to say that each ball has its own sphericity. So there are as many sphericity properties as there are billiard balls. So the distinction between module tropes and modifier tropes, the best way to get a handle on it is by examples. And I'll explain why I think that's the best strategy in a moment. But so you can just ask about a sphericity trope. You say, so the sphericity of the ball, which is not the same thing as the ball, it grounds the character of the ball. It's sort of that in virtue of which the ball is spherical. That trope, is it itself spherical or not? Right. And if you say that the trope is itself spherical, then it's what I call a module trope. If you say no, the sphericity trope is not itself spherical, it's the ball that's spherical, then you have a modifier trope.
Yeah.
Now you can also think of this in terms of whether or not properties are self-exemplifying. And the debate over self-exemplification goes way back to Plato. And I prefer not to explain the modifier distinction in terms of self-exemplification only, because the concept of self-exemplification is not a pre-theoretical concept. And it can be misleading as well. Okay. But let's go back to the concept of a module trope and think about what that would mean. So
can I drag you down a little bit? It's just into the
yeah,
morass.
please.
Into the morass.
Okay.
Correct me here. But a self-exemplification when it comes to like a universal, if a universal is self-exemplifying, it'd be like the form or the universal of a triangle is itself triangular, right?
Yes.
It's self-exemplifying, or like the form of goodness is good. It's got like an arrow that turns back on itself, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's so the reason I don't like to put much weight on the concept of self-exemplification is precisely because we picture this arrow, where it's sort of like something sort of painting itself.
Right.
So hold that thought. So a module trope, then, let's just keep with the example of sphericity. If a sphericity trope is a module trope, then the trope is itself spherical.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's primitively spherical. So it's not spherical in virtue of some process or, some action that it does to itself, right?
Yeah.
It's better just to say, I think, that a module trope is primitively charactered in some way.
Okay.
Yeah. So you can think of a module trope then as being primitively charactered in some specific way. So a sphericity trope would be primitively spherical.
Okay.
And to say it's primitively spherical means it just is spherical, and there's no deeper explanation.
Because then you get this regress, right? Because then you'd need another spherical trope in order to do that.
Yeah, there's not another trope inside of it.
Yeah.
That grounds its being spherical. Right?
Okay. Yeah.
So one helpful view as a foil to keep on the table is called austere nominalism.
Mm-hmm.
And the austere nominalist thinks, look, we don't need properties. We don't need to postulate the existence of properties. Instead, we just take objects to be primitively charactered, right? So each book on your shelf would be primitively charactered the way that it is, right? You don't try and explain it in terms of there being properties per se. Right?
Yeah.
So that's roughly austere nominalism. The trope theorist, in a way, deploys the same strategy, but at the level of tropes. The difference is supposed to be that the austere nominalist sort of takes the character of ordinary objects to be primitive, but the character of ordinary objects is thick, right? So ordinary objects are multiply charactered, like they have mass and shape and so on. And so they take what I call thick character to be primitive. The module trope theorist wants to take each trope to be thinly charactered, right?
Yeah.
It's just charactered in one way, and that's primitive. So what's primitive then is not thick character, but thin character.
Yeah.
So each module trope is primitively, thinly charactered.
That's so good. Oh man, that's so good. That's really, really helpful. That just really helped.
The other thing to add though is that the kind of character we're talking about is probably best called natural character, right?
Okay.
So for example, if you said, well, look, any entity whatsoever has the property of being self-identical, of existing, right?
Yeah.
So you can come up with lots of predicates that are satisfied by any given object. And so you could say about a module trope, well, how can it be only charactered in one way, being spherical? After all, it's also self-identical, right? It's my favorite trope. Like you can describe it in lots of ways.
Right.
And so, in the literature, there's this distinction between, natural and non-natural character. And the way to think about a module trope is in terms of natural character. Whatever the fundamental joints are in nature, the most basic kinds of character, whether it's mass or charge or whatever it turns out to be.
Yeah.
The module trope theorist is going to say, at the ground floor, there are tropes, each one of which is charactered in only one of those ways.
Yeah.
So that's
in those natural ways. Yeah, it's their natural character, and that's really the one that. See, that's where self-exemplification might come back and help. It's the natural character is the one that's self-exemplified by that trope.
Yeah, it's
that module trope.
Yeah, a module trope is primitively, naturally, singly character.
And it has these extra ones just in virtue of everything having those extra ones, like it's identical with itself and those things. But that's not net.
It's tricky.
Yeah, it's not natural.
I don't. I myself don't go in for module tropes.
Yeah.
Precisely because I think there are problems lurking here.
Okay.
Yeah. So one thing you could say is, well, why don't we need? How do we make sense of this distinction between natural character and whatever we call the other one, non-natural character?
Yeah.
Why? How do we account for the fact that multiple objects are all the same with respect to being self-identical, right?
Right.
And so, one move is to say, well, if every entity whatsoever is a certain way, then you don't need to postulate a property per se to account for it. It's just a feature that something has in virtue of existing.
There's a line in the Incredibles movie where the villain says, "If everyone's special, then no one is." And
right?
It's yeah.
It doesn't need an explanation. Like why,
right.
Or the need for an explanation is much less pressing, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
The other move to make is to say that certain features come with certain categories. So the category of everything in the category of trope has certain features, like I should say features in scare quotes, right? They're but better to say every entity that's a trope satisfies certain predicates. That is, certain things are true of it, primitively so.
Sure.
Right. like being a trope.
Yeah.
Or, whatever you want to say about all the tropes. You get those for free.
Okay. Yeah.
And, whether that works out in the end, I don't know. But
Yeah, mundane characters or something like that. Someone can come up with a good name for it.
yeah, they're kind of formal features. I think I use that phrase.
Okay.
Like there's natural character and then there's formal character. Formal character is like being self-identical or being such as to be, I don't know, think about these weird disjunctive properties that you can just come up with at will.
Yeah.
Everything satisfies them, but that doesn't mean we need a property per se to account for those
Right.
things.
Okay. This is
That's
so
the
good.
module trope. I don't know. Are you ready to move on to the next
I am.
modifier?
I thought we should do due diligence. There we go. It's almost out there. And it the Incredibles quote might have been if everyone's super. Some of my fans or listeners will hit me on that. Yeah, that's. I mean, I'm with you. So you taught me about this. I learned from you. So I'm like, yeah, I don't go in for module tropes. That's crazy. You wouldn't say they're crazy probably, but I'm with you. So yeah. So modifier tropes are like where it's at. Like I'm with you on that. So let's jump in on them.
Well, one more thing about module tropes.
Yeah.
So there's a sense in which the concept of a module trope, I don't want to say it's trivial, but it becomes almost an empirical issue. So could there be a world where there are entities that, could there be a world where the natural character in that world is different from the natural character in our world? So maybe a world where there's no mass or charge or spin, I don't know, but just some other kind of where the natural character there is very different from what's natural here.
Yeah.
But in this other world, it's possible for an object to have just one dimension of natural character, right? To be charactered in exactly one way in the natural sense. I don't think we can rule that out.
Okay.
And so there's a sense in which it's just like, well, it's module tropes. I think a module trope is a possible kind of entity.
Okay.
Yeah, and
so if you go in for like possible worlds and stuff, there could be a possible world where it's just module tropes.
Yeah, how can we rule that out? I mean,
Yeah.
that there could be a world where there are entities there that are, with respect to natural character, just only naturally charactered in one way. Suppose there's some world that has, I don't know, 6 types of natural character, right?
Yeah.
And every object in that world has only one kind of natural character, right? They would be, on my way of defining it, they would all be module tropes.
Okay. That's wild. But it's it may be it's a possibility. Yeah, I like that.
I mean, what's controversial really about module tropes, I think, is what they're good for, what they can do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's for me, what's difficult about module tropes is whether they can do what they're supposed to do with the character that we find in our world. Yeah, and given what's natural, whether they're coherent or not.
Yeah. So in another possible world, there's a Robert Garcia who's thinly charactered himself, who maybe just is a trope, and he's doing all the work with these tropes right now.
Well, I don't know if I could be a trope, but
yeah, it's, there's one of my former guests. He's been on a few times. Josh Sijuade argues that God is a trope ultimately, and I don't quite understand what he means by that. I need to listen back on our stuff, but yeah,
I don't understand that claim either. The only way I can understand it is that if God is metaphysically simple, and there are a number of distinct truths, about God, or distinct predicates that God satisfies, then, we think of God in the way that a austere nominalist thinks about ordinary objects.
Yeah.
But in that case, I don't think it'd be true that God is only singly naturally charactered. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know how to make sense of the application there. I should talk to him more about it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Maybe we can make that happen too. I'm sorry, Josh, for not being able to represent your view better, but
Me too. Yeah. I'm excited to look at it more.
Yeah, he's awesome. So he's okay. Okay, so let's get in on modifier tropes. We got modules that are, I'm sorry, but they're exemplifying. And I know you don't like that, but we just talked about it, so everyone just listen to that. Now we got this other thing that's different. It's a modifier. Yeah, I don't want to steal the thunder here. So yeah.
Yeah, it's just so it's a non-shareable property that does not have the natural character that it grounds in its bearer, right? So if a sphericity trope is not itself spherical, then it's a modifier trope.
Yeah.
And what's peculiar about modifier tropes is so unlike a module trope where you could say, oh, the trope is itself such and such a way, it's naturally such and such a way, it's itself spherical. You can't say that about a modifier trope. Instead, you just say, well, it's something that makes something else spherical, right?
Yeah.
Where the making is not efficient causal, it's grounding.
Okay.
So that's the way to think about a modifier trope. It doesn't have the character that it grounds. If you want to say it's non-self-exemplifying, that's fine. That's so it's hard to know what kind of character it actually has.
Yeah, that's my next one. Yeah, that's my next question.
That's one of the worries about the concept of a modifier trope is it looks like it's a functional concept in the sense that we're sort of told what it does or can do, but with respect to the trope itself, well, it's non-shareable. It accounts for, or grounds the character of other objects. On most trope theories, tropes are contingent entities and so on, but
okay.
We don't get very close to what it is in itself. And I think that's a weakness, not a fatal flaw, but we're not told what the trope itself is like. We're just told what it does.
Yeah, and at first I thought that was kind of weird, but now I'm thinking, what if they're all like green or something, or what if they all have some particular property or a trope grounds all of them, and we just can't see it because we don't see the tropes. It's like a metaphysical concept. It could be whatever, but we use them because of the function that they perform. Like we see their action there, and I think I don't know a ton about electrons, but I wonder if you could do the same kind of thing where you're like, oh, we see the electron by its function. We see it by what it does, and so it's a similar type of concept. I can't tell you everything about it, but I can tell you what it does, and so we should postulate that they're there.
I'm sympathetic to that. I think you're right that we sometimes don't get much more than a functional concept.
Yeah.
It's it'd be nice to know more about the thing itself. I think if the only difference between two theories is that one has its basic entities are only functionally described and the other one can say more about the intrinsic nature of the things, I think the latter view seems to have an edge, an advantage.
Yeah. And you could kind of cheat a little bit and say, well, we can't say some things about them. We can say all the formal characters. It's identical with itself, and we got some stuff that we got going on. Just not as far, I guess, as the module folks would say.
Yes. Yeah.
Though that concept's kind of that has its own problems, so maybe we don't want that. It seems like we don't want that. Yeah.
Yeah. The thing to keep in mind about a modifier trope is that it's a characterizer. That is, it
Hmm.
makes something else
Yeah.
charactered, right? So, and this is the intuition behind modifier tropes is you say, well, look, it's the ball that's spherical, right? Like the property itself. Why would you think the property itself is spherical?
Right.
Um, and you can really get this going if you think about other kinds of properties like courage. Like being courageous is that itself courageous? I
Right.
mean,
Right.
um, yeah, there are lots of properties that are hard to make sense of if you think of them as being self-exemplifying.
Yeah.
Um, Triangularity, right?
Yeah.
But the many of the arguments for trope theory over against like realism, where we have universals, many of those arguments sort of assume that tropes are module tropes.
Yeah.
So there is an intuition going the other direction, and the intuition is something like, well, look, I can see the color of the object, right?
Yeah.
Um, aren't I seeing the whiteness of the screen? Or um, it looks like properties, in one way of thinking about it, are what we're directly aware of, right?
Right. Right.
Or if somebody is, well, what burned your hand? Well, it was the temperature of the stove, right? The hotness of the stove burned my hand.
Right.
It looks like you're taking the property of the temperature, the hotness, if you will, to be the thing that caused the burn on your hand.
Yeah.
For those arguments to work, at least I've tried to argue, um, you need to think of tropes as being module tropes. So if hotness is a modifier trope, then the trope itself is not
It's not
hot,
hot. Yeah.
right? Um, yeah,
So you can't.
if
Yeah.
a,
You can't get burned by a modifier trope. You get burned by whatever it's modifying to make hot.
right,
Yeah.
it's the stove that's hot in virtue of having the trope.
Yeah.
Um, it's not the trope that's the hot thing. Um,
Yeah. Well, can you have both, or is that if you had like a principled way to say we got both here? Can you have both in one paradigm?
I mean, you could try it. I think that there are people who like David Robb. I think he has both on his view.
Okay.
Um, he doesn't call it. He doesn't use the distinction. But I don't think it is advantageous to try and have both.
Okay.
I think you end up with a kind of you lose the advantages of each and you gain the weaknesses of both kind of problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
That stinks. Yeah. Well, so
yeah.
how would a realist describe heat? Would they say that the property of heat is being, realized, or it adheres in the stove, or it's participating in heatness to a certain degree?
I mean, the realist, that is someone who believes in universals, they face the same dilemma, if you will,
Okay.
between whether or not universals are self-exemplifying or not.
Yeah.
Um, and my own view is that realists have not sort of been explicit about this,
Hmm.
at least recently. In Plato, it's like a big problem, whether or not the forms are self-exemplifying or paradigmatic or not.
Yeah.
That was like a major criticism um, of Plato's forms. But if you look at D.M. Armstrong, for example,
Sure.
kind of like the 20th century leading advocate for universals,
Hmm.
it is extremely difficult to figure out whether his universals are self-exemplifying or not.
Okay.
You have to kind of make an educated guess, and my educated guess is that they're not self-exemplifying. But it's not just crystal clear, and it's kind of surprising that for someone who's written so much about universals, it's not part of the sort of explicit description, right?
Yeah.
That you wouldn't
Yeah.
have to just guess, So I think that realists face the same choice, and in a sense, the advantages parallel the advantages and disadvantages of tropes
Okay.
on this choice point.
We might have
But
to. I don't know. Maybe there's already language for it, but yeah, using the module and modifier language could be helpful in that conversation as well with amongst realists.
yeah, I think if you think of universals as being self-exemplifying, then you might just call them paradigmatic universals or paradigms. And then my colleague Anne-Marie Schultz suggested the label merely formal for universals that are non-self-exemplifying. They're just and it was funny, I asked her, she's a Plato scholar, and I said, so we use this word paradigm for Platonic forms that are self-exemplifying. They're paradigmatic. What do we call the other ones on the other view that aren't self-exemplifying? And there's not like a ready-to-go label for it. There should be, I guess, but her suggestion was that we call them merely formal. So that's what I've been calling them.
Okay. Yeah, I see
that. But the realist faces the same choice.
Yeah, and I see the work and the problems that both have. Because it's counterintuitive to think there's just heat out there in Plato's realm that's just hot. It just is hot right now, and especially if you go in for theistic conceptualism of any stripe, now you have like God, a part of God's mind, and if you toss in simplicity too, is just hot, And if heat, if like your colleague Dr. Ward there thinks that it's an aspect of God that's being portrayed, then there's like an aspect of God that's really hot and another aspect that's really cold, and he's so awesome too. I love giving a hard time about all this stuff. But
I actually favor his view. So
I heard you say that in the talk. That was pretty wild. Yeah.
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 I like his view.
Well, that brings us to like theistic conferralism. I think it's a natural little bridge here. Unless you had anything else to say on modifiers and module tropes.
Well, there's one thing. So it has to do with the distinction between modifier and module tropes. Is relevant for one reason. It's relevant is because it has implications for how you further analyze objects, right?
Yeah.
So many trope theorists want to be bundle theorists, where they take ordinary objects to be mere bundles of tropes.
Mm-hmm.
And then the alternative to that, one of them, is to go in for a kind of substance attribute view, where you pair tropes with substrata, basically, and sometimes they're called bare particulars, substrata. Yeah. And my own view that I've tried to argue for is that modifier tropes just don't work for a bundle theory. On a bundle theory, you're supposed to say, well, an object, the billiard ball, say, is just a bundle of tropes, right? But if those tropes themselves are modifier tropes, then none of the tropes is itself spherical.
Yeah.
And so what is it that's spherical? It has to be the bundle. If anything, it has to be the bundle. But how is it that the bundle is spherical? And so the problem then is how do you think about what bundles are themselves, such that they're the sorts of things that can be spherical, and be spherical in virtue of having a non-spherical trope as a constituent. And
because it's tropes all the way down, right? I could see someone imagining that, like, well, no, you have the tropes, which are kind of like form, and then you have like the actual matter, and they character the actual matter. But in this view, it's even the matter is tropes. It's all tropes, and it's just a bundle of all these things.
Yes, and so it's I think it's hard to do a bundle theory with modifier tropes.
Okay.
And in fact, you usually find modifier tropes in a trope theory that goes in for substance or substrata as well, where it's the substrata is that which gets to be characterized
Yeah.
by the tropes
Yeah.
that it has.
But you
Yeah.
can't say anything about that substrata because it has no tropes. It's just this bare
It
particular.
itself is, yeah, I mean, bare particulars are notoriously tricky to characterize.
Yeah.
But I think I think Tim Pickavants has a paper in APQ on bare particulars and exemplification that I think kind of clears up the usual worries about that.
Okay.
So I just want to put in a plug for his paper.
That's great because I JP mentioned this in our philosophy of science class and just goes, yeah, bare particulars, and I'm kind of I lean that way myself, and I was like, JP, no, what are you saying right now? So that's really good. Yeah, I'll check out the Pickavants paper to help me with this.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so good. Well, okay, so you have this theistic conferralism, and Robert, is this original to you?
I think so.
Okay, nice. And I should ask too about module and modifier. Is that something that you came up with? Is that your terminology?
So the terms are mine. The
Nice.
concept is so Mike Lux was my advisor,
Yeah.
and he came up with a distinction one day, and he labeled it as the distinction between tropes and tropers,
Ah,
right? And and so I wrote my whole dissertation using this language, tropes and tropers.
okay.
And it's fun. The word troper is really fun to use.
Yeah.
And Mike's view is that all the major trope theorists thought of tropes as what I call modifier tropes.
Yeah.
And so Mike introduced this idea of a troper, which is what I call a module trope. And Mike introduced this as a new concept that he thought would solve some problems that trope theorists face.
Yeah.
So his idea was, hey, all the popular trope theorists like Keith Campbell and D.C. Williams, for example, they're working with what I have come to call modifier tropes, and they ought to consider a different notion, a troper, which is what I call a module trope. Anyhow, and I wrote my dissertation kind of based on that assumption, actually. And then when I finished my dissertation, soon after, I realized that that it's a mistake, actually, that if anything, most of those trope theorists that he was referring to and that I was referring to, they're either ambiguous on this distinction or they actually go in for module tropes.
Okay.
So Keith Campbell and Keith Campbell for sure had module tropes, and DC Williams probably did. It's tricky to say. So unfortunately, Lux's terminology of troper and trope didn't fit the actual literature.
Okay.
In fact, most of the trope theorists turn out to be troper theorists on Mike's way of drawing the distinction. So anyhow, I don't know if that all made sense, but
it does.
I try to explain it in a footnote somewhere. But so he drew the distinction, the conceptual distinction, and he proposed the labels trope and troper. And that's what I worked with at first. And then I came to see, this is not an apt set of labels for the concepts. We need a better label. And so I just came up with modifier and module.
Well, so modifier, I totally get. Makes a lot of sense. But why'd you pick module? Because like a module is like, I think you're working through something and you have to do this module first and then you get to the next one.
Yeah. It took me a while to come up with a label that I liked. And, it's sort of, got tired of coming up with ideas. So it's not ideal, but
Okay.
the idea modifier seems like that works.
Yeah.
Module is supposed to be something like, well, it's a sort of self-contained unit. It's
Ah.
modular. It can it stands on its own. It's sort of it's a kind of it doesn't have to relate to something else. You can kind of arrange them and stack them up and so on, but
Yeah.
each one is kind of defined in its own way. But
Yeah. I like it. I get it now. I get the self-contained unit makes sense to me. Yeah. It's got its natural character in there. It's just this little thing. Yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. So finally, I kept on bringing us back to Conferralism, then taking us off on a rabbit trail. So creaturely properties are modifier tropes and are identical with God's divine act of sustenance. That's at least in a couple papers that you've written. And you've been working on it some more. You gave us a paper at the SCP. So when you say creaturely properties, is that like any property that's not God's property is identical with God's divine act of sustenance?
yes, I don't want to include God's properties if God has properties
Yeah.
in this proposal.
Okay.
Yeah, so creaturely properties. It's a theory about creaturely properties.
Yeah.
Yeah, properties, whatever the natural properties are that creatures have,
Yeah.
or could have.
Yeah. Okay. And so initially hearing this, there is a little bit of like occasionalism that pops up where you're like, oh, well, if you're grounding this in like God's divine activity, then of, sustaining his creation, maybe, occasionalism. But you say that theistic conferralism actually protects against occasionalism and deism as like the two kind of ditches that this is the via media through. Um, I guess real quick, like, what do we mean by sustenance? And then how does this protect us from deism and occasionalism?
Yeah, sustenance. One of the sort of standard doctrines in monotheism is that sometimes it's called preservation, but
Hmm.
that God um, ensures that the contingent things, the creatures, continue to exist, right?
Yeah.
We're if you're not God, then you're not self-existent, and so you could cease to exist, right? And
Mm.
it's by God's gracious action that you stay in existence. Roughly, that's a broad notion of sustenance. So here's a quote from Richard Swinburne. He says, "God is our supreme benefactor. We owe our existence from moment to moment, and our powers and pleasures, our knowledge and desires, to his sustaining power."
Mm.
And there are several verses in the Bible that talk about this too. So that's sustenance.
Yeah.
Um, the idea that God holds everything in existence. And there's Catherine Tanner drew a distinction between a narrow and a broad understanding of sustenance,
Mm.
and the narrow understanding has to do with just accounting for the existence of things, upholding things in existence.
Yeah.
And then Hugh McCann called that existence conferral.
Okay.
So sustenance involves conferring the continual conference of existence on creatures. Um, the broader notion of sustenance involves not just existence conferral, but what I call property conferral,
Mm.
whereby God supplies creatures with their properties from moment to moment. So
Yeah.
you, in the narrow, in the broad, in the sorry, in the narrow sense of sustenance, you owe your continued existence to God, God's preserving action. In the broad sense, you also owe your character, or your nature, you're having the powers and properties that you do, from moment to moment. God also is involved in seeing to it that you have those things, because those are also contingent features, right? Not just your existence, but you're having the properties that you do and so on.
Yeah. And it's a continued under this schema, it's a continued thing that he's continually doing. He didn't just set up shop and then it's going on its own.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good. That's good. So if I remember it correctly from Kevin Van Hooser's class at Trinity, it's like you got providence, you have governance, which God is ruling over, and then a subset of governance, depending on how you parse it, is like concurrence, which that's where the Calvinists get in trouble with free will and God's sovereignty. That's the one that everyone wants to focus there. And then you have the preservation usually is like at least in our classes was like, oh, of course, yeah, God, in Christ all things hold together, preservation, no problem. But it's cool that even preservation, you can make more fine-grained distinctions and get at the joints. What's God really doing? And you're saying that he's conferring our existence, right? Our existence and our properties from moment to moment.
Yeah. I mean, and you can see this in these. There's several quotes I could give you, but the one I gave you from Swinburne, we owe our existence and our powers and pleasures.
Yeah.
And you see that in many statements of sustenance. It's not just that God holds you in existence; it's also that He supplies you continually with your powers and your properties and so on.
Yeah.
And that's what I call property conferral.
Yeah.
Now the worry though is that if you go in for property conferral, that you're going to end up into what people call strong occasionalism.
Yeah.
The idea that everything that happens in the world, that all events are sort of directly caused by God.
Right.
And that's, you don't want to go there, right? For obvious reasons. Bad things happen, evil things happen. And so you want some kind of, you want to leave room for creatures to be the originators of some of the things that happen. Anyhow, so one worry then is that property conferral seems to entail a kind of strong occasionalism, because you're saying, well, if God is supplying something with its properties, then it sounds like you're saying, so God is sort of making something charactered in the way that it is, right?
Yeah.
God's conferring here's some shape, here's some mass, right? That he's sort of, making something spherical or making something massive and so on. And if you understand that kind of, if you understand that in an efficient causal way, then yes, that does give you this kind of nasty occasionalism.
Yeah.
My proposal though is that if we take property conferral to involve formal causation and not efficient causation, then we can avoid occasionalism. And so more specifically then, the idea is that to say that God supplies an object with its properties, suppose we're talking about the billiard ball, we're saying, look, the billiard ball is spherical, and God supplies it with that property. My proposal is that we think of property conferrals, these divine actions of conferring properties, as modifier tropes.
Yeah.
So that just is the modifier trope of sphericity just is a divine action whereby God spherizes, but in a formal sense, not in an efficient causal sense.
Yeah.
God spherizes the ball.
Yeah. Your talks were so awesome at SCP, and you weren't able to, or you gave a lot of time for questions. So you didn't go through a part of your PowerPoint presentation, and you said, if someone asks a question, I'll just refer to my thing. And I asked this question here at this point, because I was like, look, this kind of, if it's in the formal sense, it sounds like God is this passive agent and we're just kind of like stealing from him or forcing his hand. We say it's divine action, but really it's my action, and I'm taking these tropes from him. And I was just so excited that you said, well, I have a PowerPoint for that. And I I don't remember the answer because I was so jazzed that I got a good question in on you. What do you make of that objection that, like, well, if it's in the formal sense, it seems like God is not taking an active role in preservation.
Yeah. Well, I think there are two questions or worries there. One is that God isn't taking an active role, and the other one is that somehow we're compelling God to cooperate
Yeah.
with us, right?
And some
Uh,
bad stuff too, right? Because that's what you talked about earlier with occasion, like if I have a bad nature and then the next moment he gave me that bad nature again, like he could just give me a good nature, right? Or something like that.
right, right. Um, so, in terms of the is God implicated here? Are we um, um, compelling God to participate in things that are immoral or evil?
Yeah.
Is that part of the worry?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I don't think my view is any worse off than the sort of standard theistic position here, where we say,
Yeah.
um, so why didn't God intervene to stop Hitler or
Right.
Putin or whatever? He's like, he could have. He's sort of cooperating with the natural course of events. Why didn't he just sort of take the world out of existence?
Hmm.
So just pull existence conferral, right? Let's just pull
Yeah.
the plug.
Yeah.
Um, you know, I feel like your worry seems to have just as much teeth for existence conferral as it does for property conferral.
Yeah.
Um, Another way to put that is, yeah, I mean, God is going along with us in a way.
Yeah.
But that's not a unique implication of my view.
Yeah.
I don't think it's any worse on my view either.
I think it just makes it more clear. And it's the worry that I think you're right that all of us have to deal with, whatever your view. But I think on yours, it makes it a little bit more like fine pointed because you
mm,
have property conferral and this hammer. God conferred the property of being hard or whatever, hammerly.
right.
And I smashed my thumb. And from one moment to the next, if he would have just foregone conferring that property to the next moment, made it or exchange it with a squeaky toy, then I would have hit my thumb with a squeaky toy. But then again, so I think it's just sharpening and saying, look, this is what we're focusing on. All of us have to deal with. But on your view, because you have property conferral, it just says here the problem's made clear. And I think maybe you could just go in for like C.S. Lewis's stable environment type stuff and go,
Oh,
what would the world even look like if everything turned into rubber duckies when we were going to hurt
right,
ourselves?
right. Yeah, I think that that's the way to go here. Um, I don't see it as a problem that's especially difficult from my view, and not even a problem that's especially difficult
Hmm.
in general,
Yeah.
precisely because, like you said, Lewis makes a good point about that. Like, we need a stable environment
Yeah.
for us to accomplish the goods, for God to accomplish the goods that He has for us.
Hmm.
And any standard theodicy is going to, uh, in one way or another, I think, have to assume that there are goods that God is trying to bring about
Yeah.
that are sufficiently great and outweighing to justify the evils that are necessary to bring them about.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah. Which is just, I think your view just helps us all get clear. I think it does sharpen it. So it's just here's what is actually in focus. I think that's really interesting because all of us think that God, unless you're a deist, yeah, unless you're a deist, you think God is sustaining creation, and so He is sustaining my powers from one. If maybe you don't go in for power ontology, whatever, but
yeah,
my action, my action.
right,
Um, but then
yeah,
the second concern is like the Jesus in a robe and his robe objection. Like the woman touches his robe, and Jesus goes, "Whose power went out from my power went out from me? Who touched me?" And it's like that, but for everything. Like I got a haircut, or I cut my own hair. God's like, "Whose power? Where'd this power go?"
okay. So this is the worry that um, somehow God is being compelled to perform, if I could put it that way, these
Yeah.
formal causes, to characterize, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as I have a lump of clay and I'm shaping it, and uh, I somehow achieve a perfect sphere in Play-Doh, right? And
Yeah.
right as I get to that perfect sphericity moment, you know, God formally spherizes the lump, right?
Yeah.
Um, um, so one thing to maybe do at this point is just to say, think about how this looks on another view. Suppose you have universals, uh, standard kind of Armstrong kind of view, where unless it's assumed sphericity is one of the universals, just for the sake of argument, it's it exists, right? It's available to do its spherizing work,
Yeah.
right? And as I get my lump of clay into this shape, like it somehow is what finishes the job, or it comes and does its spherizing work. Um, like what compels it? Like what?
Mm.
Um, it's not like sphericity as a universal in the Armstrong sense is paying attention.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an odd thing that's not explained on Armstrong's view. That universals sort of do the work exactly when they're supposed to do their work.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, are they causally like efficacious on Armstrong's view?
no, I think they're formal causes
Okay.
with respect to the role they play as universals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what if it's like if it's the direction's the other way? So like I'm forming the clay, and then as it's finally hits that perfect form, it just sucks the form down.
But
Instead of the
right,
form
but
having to pay
what
attention.
how does that work? I
No, I
mean,
don't. I have no idea.
yeah. So I'm just
It
I have
participates. What about participating? Is that any better? Like now
oh,
it's
yeah. So
exemplifying.
suppose we say, well, now your lump of clay exactly resembles
Yeah.
this, form of sphericity.
Hmm.
Well, for that to work, the form needs to be self-exemplifying, probably,
Okay.
for that resemblance to be true.
Okay.
But how is that doing any kind of formal causation, like mere resemblance? Um,
Mm.
but honestly, I'm
Yeah.
just kind of picking on the rival view here.
So good. I love it. Yeah, that's
And
I'm tempted towards that view, so I'm glad you're picking on it.
on my view, um, you know, yes, God is cooperating constantly,
Hmm.
because everything is constantly in a flux of gaining and losing properties, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so, we have some kind of resource to explain how it is that properties do the work they're supposed to do when they're supposed to do it.
Yeah.
Um, but in terms of compelling God to act, so to speak, um, I don't think that that's especially worrisome. I mean, I think God has agreed when God creates the world, he sort of commits himself to follow certain general policies already, right?
Yeah.
It's not like he's caught by surprise.
Right.
Oh, I got to supply sphericity at this point. So I don't think it's worrisome.
Okay.
I'd want to know. I guess I'd want to shift the burden and say why I think this is a problem. You
Yeah.
know,
Does it commit you to like a strong view of meticulous providence?
say more. Like, give me an example of.
Well, so it seems like sometimes my open theist friends or something will talk about God being like a micromanager or something on 'cause I'm a Calvinist myself, and they go, yeah, he's micromanaging, but on this, usually what I perhaps since we're talking about preservation and not concurrence, then it wouldn't matter as much, but eh, on this view, everything happens by God's say so, even like my mustache continuing into existence. But that's most views, right? But he continually There's just something about like God actually doing the work and of conferring it. If there was something like between conferral and deism, where like God could grant like existence to the world, and it
Mhm.
could exist while he's just kind of spinning the plate instead of actively going in and adjusting all the tropes.
Right.
Um, do you see what I'm getting at? Why someone might think like this is micromanaging?
Um, I see the worry. One thing you can do is think about how these questions or how these issues look on rival accounts.
Yeah.
So go back to Armstrong's account, right?
Hmm.
Or what I'm calling Armstrong's account, right?
Sure.
Just
Sure.
where you have universals, they're non-self-exemplifying. Um, they're sort of waiting to do their work, right? Uh, he thinks Armstrong accepts the principle of instantiation. So universals don't exist if they're not exemplified,
Hmm.
but that doesn't matter. So suppose
Sure.
you have 5 spheres, on in Texas, and somebody in New York is about to make a sphere, right? So sphericity is available to do its work,
Yeah.
right, in New
Yeah.
York.
Yeah.
Um, okay. Um, so there's the efficient causal process where somebody is shaping the Play-Doh, and it reaches a certain moment where the Play-Doh becomes a sphere, right? So the efficient causal process. Um, well, now the universal sphericity does its formal causal work,
Hmm.
right? And so I think what we want to say, but this is something that has to be said by anybody who believes in universals.
Yeah.
Like, what's the order here? You don't want to say it's a temporal priority that the efficient cause, brings about a sphere, and then temporally after that, the formal cause happens, right?
Right. Right.
I think what you want to say is that the efficient cause is logically prior to the formal cause, but both causes are at work.
Yeah. If there's any kind of lag, that's super weird.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
don't. Yeah, there couldn't be a lag.
Yeah.
So, I mean, honestly, when I start thinking along these lines, I just think, gosh, properties are just weird.
So
Like
weird.
why are we going in for formal causes? And but yeah, they're weird. And I've one thing that's happened to me in just proposing this view is it makes me reconsider the whole project of
Hmm.
going in for property ontology.
Yeah.
It's something like, well, if divine actions could be properties, then maybe we just don't need properties.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
But my point is, on Armstrong's view, uh, no more or less than on my view, you can say that there's a logical priority to the efficient cause,
Yeah.
right? The efficient cause is logically prior to the formal cause, um, but they cooperate, right?
Sure. Sure.
It's just that in my view, the formal cause is a divine action.
Yeah. Okay.
They're both at
Um,
work.
that's good. Yeah, I like that. And there the properties are grounded in God's nature, right? Like or in his being, because I know you said you're partial to Tom Ward's view.
I am partial to his view. I think my theistic conferralism doesn't require
Right.
divine conceptualism. I think it plays well with it.
Okay.
Um, I favor a view like Tom Ward's view
Okay.
with my own kind of, twists on it. But that way you have God as sort of the ultimate exemplar,
Hmm.
um, and his actions, the things I'm calling modifier tropes, are in a sense, expressions of God's character. So each modifier trope, which formally naturally characterizes an object,
Yeah.
is an expression of some, one way you could say some divine idea, but on Ward's way you'd say on some way that God is.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Exemplar.
Yeah, and my own view is that the relationship between God's character and the creature's character is not exact similarity.
Sure.
So, the idea that well, being a lion is a natural character, so God is a lion, or
Yeah.
being mud. Tom plays with these examples.
Yeah.
Anyhow, we'd need a whole nother show to talk about this stuff. But
Yeah.
I would not want to say that there's exact similarity, right? I'd want to say that God's way of being.
Would you say analogous, or are you going to pull in some analogy?
No, I wouldn't say analogous.
Okay.
Actually, I like C.S. Lewis's notion of transposition.
Yeah, for sure.
I would use that to characterize the relationship between the creature and God. So,
that's fantastic. I love that you said that.
Oh,
I love
cool.
that essay. It's such a good essay. Yeah.
It is. I find it extremely useful, and sorry everybody for not explaining it.
There's no time. Everyone go read it. I think it's in the Weight of Glory book, which is a collection of like 5 essays of Lewis's, including the Weight of Glory. Yeah.
So a transposition is a kind of diluted expression of a richer reality, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a shadow is a transposition. So if I put my hand up on the wall, you see my shadow. Where's my hand? A shadow is a transposition of my hand. It's not analogous. I mean, to say it's an analogy is not quite right.
Yeah.
So my own view is that natural character found among creatures, being a lion, right, is a transposition of God's character, right?
Man, that's good. That's really good. I like that.
You have to say a lot more, but yeah. Anyhow,
that's good. Okay, so there's a couple real quick ones I just want to ask you about. Real quick on, I don't want to make you defend Armstrong's view or anything, but on Armstrong's view, if we got everything, all the spheres into the Sphere Museum, and itself maybe was even spherical, and we blew it up, are spheres no longer, like, no one can make a sphere anymore?
Yeah, I mean, one of the weird things about Armstrong's view, or anyone for that matter who holds to the principle of instantiation, you're saying, well, the existence of a property depends upon some object having that property, right?
Mm-hmm.
So sphericity exists only if there's a sphere somewhere, right? So you're saying, put all the spheres in one room, blow it up, right?
Yeah.
What happens to the property? I mean, it depends on your view of time, right? If you're a 4-dimensionalist about time, then
it exists somewhere.
That's one way out of it, is to pair the principle of instantiation with a kind of 4-dimensionalism.
Huh.
But if you're a presentist, and Mike Lux, I don't know if he ever wrote this up, but he used to talk about this. So Aristotle was a presentist who believed in the principle of instantiation.
Yeah.
So he precisely has this kind of problem as well.
Interesting.
You can't, if you blow up all the spheres, you take sphericity out of existence.
Can you bring it back?
Well, then, what happens when you get your
bootstrapping?
Clay
You get a bootstrapping
roll
problem.
your clay together, and
it just doesn't happen. It just doesn't form into the sphere.
Yeah, I can't get it there.
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah.
Okay.
He has a paper somewhere, I think, where he talks about this. But...
Okay. Yeah, that's awesome. All right. So finishing up here, I talked about it in the opening, I think. So I think we're stuck with it. But NFTs, non-fungible tokens. I thought this would be a fun one to ask you about because you talk about tropes, and in my mind they kind of work together. But an NFT is a non-fungible token, and today it's you can get them on OpenSea, which is like the eBay for NFTs. It's this crazy thing. Our background here is all NFTs. I thought that was kind of nice. But it's non-fungible because fungible is like replaceable fungible means being replaceable by identical items, mutually interchangeable. And I thought this was also fascinating for you because you use some stuff from C.S. Lewis to develop this unique maker idea that everything is unique. Or I think you were talking about all of us persons are unique, but I think
Yeah.
you went on to say maybe even everything is unique. So just real quick, is anything fungible? Is anything able to be replaced by identical items and mutually interchangeable on your view?
Man, I feel like we're starting a whole new podcast here.
Sorry. Yeah.
No, I don't know.
Okay.
My own view is that persons are non-fungible, to use your
Okay.
language.
Yeah.
They're irreplaceable. Not even God could replace you or duplicate you
Yeah.
on the view I have following Lewis. Whether every single thing whatsoever is irreplaceable, I favor that view. I realize it sounds weird and like, really, every blade of grass, or
Yeah.
but it depends on what you think the objects are that exist, right?
Oh yeah.
So
Man, that's a good point.
if you don't think that there are blades of grass, then one less thing to worry about.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's part of that's one of the moving pieces here is material constitution
Yeah.
and which things exist and so on.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I kind of feel open to it, but not committed on taking a full scope
Yeah.
view
Well,
about uniqueness.
well, I'm also tempted by this view. When you say it, you can make it sound kind of flowery and nice, and you can put some nice music behind it and sound cool. But it's also like this really rich idea that like I have these two highlighters here, and they look totally fungible. But like this highlighter can never ever be this highlighter, and not only can they not like occupy the same space, but like they do have a different causal history, and it depends on what we mean by fungible, but it's like everything is kind of unique. It's pretty fascinating when you think about that, and you just have to pick the level of abstraction, I guess. But yeah, the uniqueness maker type stuff is really fun. We don't think we have time to go into all of it, but when it comes to NFTs, I saw this connection between an NFT and a trope because a trope is like a theoretical postulate or posit. But like an NFT might be like a tangible, right? A tangible representation of a trope because it's supposed to be this utterly unique token. So it doesn't even matter if you take the JPEG of it and you download that. It's not the same thing because the blockchain says Robert owns this Bored Ape NFT, and so it doesn't matter. You can make as many copies as you want, but the blockchain says it's not multiply instantiable. So what do you make of that insofar as I've represented NFTs well? Is it like a tangible? I know it's not tangible, right? It's so weird to say this, but like a non-theoretical view of a trope?
Gosh, it's NFTs are so complicated in a
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
So think about the sense in which an NFT is non-fungible, right? It's non-fungible, if I understand it. You tell me.
Yeah.
In the sense that it's got sort of intrinsic to the thing is a kind of history of ownership,
Yeah.
right?
Ledger.
And
Yeah.
so who has owned it, who's currently owning it, and so on. And so if you sort of duplicate the JPEG, do a screenshot or something, I don't know. There's a sense in which the image is, you can duplicate that all day long.
Right.
But this history, this track record of it, sort of picks out one owner at a time.
Right.
So there's a sense in which an NFT is kind of something that can't be owned by more than one. Honestly, I don't think we want to say person here, because I mean, I think a family could purchase something. So,
Oh yeah. Maybe you
you
could
know,
even share it. Yeah, you could have like a joint ownership of one NFT maybe.
yeah. So there's one owner, but the owner could be understood as a group, I think.
Yeah, functional owner.
Conceptually, that seems possible.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know. And one thing that's interesting is, in terms of uniqueness, what makes an NFT unique is the kind of what do you call it? The ownership history, like who's owned it and who currently owns it.
You check the blockchain. You look at there's like a digital
Yeah,
ledger. Yeah.
yeah. This ledger, it sort of makes it unique. Yeah, that's one way something can be unique, is in terms of its path through space and time, and who's held it or owned it, things like
Right.
that.
Yeah. Like a ball hit by Babe Ruth or something. Looks
Right,
identical to the one that came off the assembly line, but it's got this causal history that's different.
right. So that is a way something can be unique, is in terms of its history, its narrative. But it's not, I don't know, whether that's intrinsic to the thing. It seems like, well, the thing could have, it's not intrinsic, obviously, but
Sure.
it's not even essential to it.
We conferred it, right? We conferred upon that, its uniqueness, maybe.
Right. The causal origin of a piece of art may be essentially, essential to it. Like, this is
Yeah.
essentially a Rembrandt, but the sort of, the ledger of ownership after that fact is certainly not essential to it.
Yeah. Well, so following that type token distinction, like if we go with Babe Ruth's baseball, there's a type. It's a baseball. I don't know how fine grained to get on that. Whether it's like a Russell ball or whatever, but it's a baseball. And then the one that he hit a home run on, that's a token of this ball, and it's different than the other tokens that came off the assembly line. But there is a type, and it's a baseball. With an NFT, it's supposed to be like the type is the token, I think, right? Like you make one picture and you mint that on OpenSea or wherever, and that you turn that into an NFT, and now there are no more tokens that are able to be made. I think it's like a collapsing of the type token distinction, but maybe I'm wrong. What do you think about that? Does that sound right?
Well, what makes it, in what sense can it not be duplicated going forward?
It can't be. You can continually sell that one, but by screenshotting it, it doesn't do anything. You don't add it to the ledger. You don't add your name to anything. You like own a copy. Let me think. That's interesting, because if you download a JPEG, that's different than taking a screenshot of something, right? Like those are two different ways. You still kind of have the same picture, but it's not the same thing. Even those two aren't the same things, right?
I don't think so. Yeah.
This is weird. We're getting weird here. Yeah. Yeah.
What is supposed to be something like, well, you can't replicate it because only one person can have it at a time, and it's the ledger that
Yeah.
decides
Yeah.
who owns it.
Yeah.
If your name isn't on the ledger, then you don't own it, even if you have something that's intrinsically the same
Yeah.
as the
Yeah.
NFT.
Exact similarity, right? It's like exact similarity, but without identity.
Yeah. I don't know. I think it's just a convention that makes it. We're just. It's a sort of a. We're agreeing on. Well, if something has this kind of ownership history, we take that to be the relevant thing that we value in the object.
Yeah.
I don't know. I have to think more about it.
Yeah.
I find the whole thing just bizarre.
Yeah.
It's really interesting, though.
Yeah.
And it's a fun. You're not the only. So I gave a talk the other day about the uniqueness of persons, and one of the person in the audience said, "So it's sort of like each person is an NFT."
Ah.
You know?
That's hilarious, man. Well,
I feel
that's
like I'm gonna have to get into this.
Yeah, that's the kind of stuff I'm trying to bring up with more of my guests, because I get these questions a lot. I work with college athletes, and this stuff comes up all the time. And so when I think about people talking about a public facing philosophy, part of that is bringing your awesome work, man. You made up these words, module tropes and modifier tropes. I love that. I want to get that out there, but I also want to get their stuff in and ask you. So I like this kind of mutual. I think that's a healthy public facing philosophy, is not just one-sided, but both ways. Because either way, if it's just the public asking you, tell me, you'll never work on anything that could be really interesting that's not interesting to the public at the time. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah. It'd be fun to do more of that. That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, dude, this was awesome. Thanks so much for all your time, man. I appreciate it. We went pretty long here, but I appreciate all your work. Thanks for sending me so many papers and helping me get clear on this. I'm gonna keep having to read through them to get more clear, but tropes are sweet, man. This is fun.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate your interest in my work and give me a chance to ramble on about some of these things. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, so Robert, before I let you go, where can people find more of your work at?
RobertKGarcia.com.
Okay, awesome. I'll link that in the description too.
Yeah, I have most of my papers are there. If something isn't there, you can email me at Robert_K_Garcia@Baylor.edu.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
But I'm happy to answer emails or share papers and so on.
Awesome, man. Yeah. Well, that's huge. That's gonna have to do it, folks. We gave you a lot here, so don't be whining here. But that's gonna have to do it for now. This was so much fun. I had a great time. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.